sing 363. Instinctively turn to you in prayer, prayer in our time of need and prayer in our time of praise. And we ask that our class together, even today, would encourage us as individuals, as families, and as your church to turn to you in prayer. It's these things for Jesus' sake. Stephen, please. Thank you. So there is a new handout on the music stand. This is one you're going to want to grab a copy of. And what I'm thinking to do here, and I think we still will do it, we might want to reconfigure tables a little bit, is to do this, as I'll explain in just a moment, as a bit of a group project. And we're going to come together then after a little bit of time has transpired and talk about some of the things that we've seen. It was a few weeks ago, and Micah, the student from Rockport, mentioned some things about Luke and Acts. And I said at the time, that's exactly right. He had noticed some things about prayer, particularly in Acts, about the church praying together, that there is a pattern, and a very interesting pattern that flows really from the beginning of Luke's gospel all the way through Acts. And again, seeing Luke and Acts in a sense as a whole, kind of in two parts because the same author. And then even how Luke introduces the book of Acts when he says to Theophilus that in his former book, he began to tell us about he tells us what Jesus began to do and to say. And so there is this sense in which, well, you turn to Acts and it's not something new. It really is the ongoing record of what Jesus does and what Jesus says. But now he's doing it and saying it through the church. So they really do, Luke and Acts, hold together as two parts of a single whole. And so what I want us to do is to look at this chart, and along the x-axis, across the top, are a series of verses, first of all from Luke's gospel, and then from the book of Acts. Some cases I've cheated a little bit by including a couple citations in a given column. But these are many, though not quite all, of the citations in Luke and Acts that relate to prayer. But what I want you to do is when you see that citation, first of all, put it into one or more of the categories that are along the y-axis, either an example of Jesus praying, or an example of Jesus teaching about prayer, or an individual praying, or a group praying. Now, there will be just a couple, because of the way I've divided the verses, that might be more than one of those categories. So feel free, if you think it belongs in more than one, to put an X through more than one. But what I want you to do is to kind of do this by tables. And again, maybe we'll combine a few of the tables here. Just work through them quickly, okay, because there's a lot of verses here. See if there's any discernible pattern that is set before us. And then as you're following through, maybe again, someone at the table is reading through the given passage, and it's pretty obvious, which category it's in. If something about the passage strikes you, feel free to write a little comment, maybe something that only you could decipher, but just see if there's anything that sticks in your mind. Who's praying, where they're praying, when are they praying, this kind of thing that might be of interest. And then we'll talk about any potential patterns and then lessons from those patterns after we come back together. So I don't know exactly how long this might take. Maybe we'll start with thinking in terms of 10 to 15 minutes again, because the goal is to kind of read through these verses, put them in a category and move on to the next. Interesting though that might be, to kind of take up more discussion, but as much as possible to try to work through the whole so that we have some sense of how this plays out in Luke's inspired narrative. So we'll start with maybe 10 to 15 minutes, see how that goes. If we need a little more time, we can take it. But let's go ahead and think about these citations or citations in Luke and Acts that relate to prayer. Instances prayer is talked about in these two books. That making talked about the this morning and give opportunity to allude to just two of the unique parables, only found in Luke, right? And if you look at a number of the parables that are unique to Luke, almost all of them has some kind of gravitational pull towards prayer. So it really is interesting that in God's providence, under the inspiration of the Spirit, Luke really records for us a fair bit of Christ's teaching about prayer. Any other of the categories that might have struck somebody? Almost all group prayer. Yeah, so we've got this really interesting dynamic going on here, a lot of group prayer in Acts. And just to think about this pattern, praying outside praying, presumably for the acceptance of the sacrifice that's being offered and praying by way of worship. But that's the only time in Luke's gospel where specifically a group of people is mentioned. So Acts has a lot of that, and the gospel itself is very lacking in that. It's really interesting. I think Edith.
Worshiping in spirit and in truth. I mean, this is talking about him helping people transition from this old way of prayer to it's like, I'm God and hey, let's snap to it.
Christ is the fullness of the ages. The completion of God's plan is coming to pass. And so we would expect in some sense that there would be some kind of movement, something, some dynamic that would be changing. And maybe again, just in a cursory way, we can recognize that between Luke and Acts, there's a dynamic changing related to prayer. So what other things do you see by way of patterns or by way of things that maybe surprise you in terms of frequency or development?
Presented the idea that Luke is complemented by Acts. You really see that Jesus' emphasis on Jesus teaching his disciples is being implemented in Acts. So many of the group prayers are for the appointment of deacons, appointment of elders, missionary journey. So it really seems like the teaching of Jesus really is being nicely implemented by the church.
Yes, yes. So it's interesting, right? Again, at least the way that Luke presents it. And again, it's not to say that the disciples never ever prayed, but throughout the gospel, they're in this place of needing to be instructed. And in that sense, at least in terms of the record, they're relatively quiet. But then you get to the book of Acts, and all of a sudden it's frequent prayer and very practical prayer, all kinds of different aspects of the life of the church. Richard.
I was just going to comment that some of the instruction was Jesus telling disciples to pray.
Yes.
Not just telling them how to pray or when to pray, but actually telling them, pray now for this.
That's right.
It's pointing so
church is to be very committed to prayer. And even these individuals who are given a place of leadership in the church recognize that apart from blessing of God sought through prayer, that their leadership is not going to bear the fruit that you would hope. Yeah.
And there's also a big chunk of the people praying for the leaders.
Right. Someone's been arrested and they're praying for release. So all of these crucial moments that the people might have been tempted to say, hey, there are things we got to get done here. You know, we got to take the bull by the horns. We've got to be action oriented. You know, if it's going to get done, we got to do it. And instead, the disposition of the church is if it's going to get done, Jesus has got to do it. And so we need to be asking him to bless us so that it would be accomplished. Teaching regarding lesser to the greater, right? So the lesson being, if even a reluctant judge and if even a man who's asleep in his bed are going to respond eventually to persistent requests, how much more, right, does a father who loves us, how much more will he respond to our persistent requests? So just to understand that Jesus is not saying God is, oh, he drags his feet. He really doesn't want to help us, but if we just kind of pester him enough, he will. No, but it's a lesser to the greater approach to teaching. So a couple other interesting passages because it's a kind of major sort of meta pattern here that I think we really want to grasp. So turn to Luke 19, verse 46. It's the first one. And someone could read verses 45 and 46. That would be super. Gospel, where is it taking place? It's always been about, of course, the way to God is made through the blood. So there's sacrifice and prayer or communion coming together in tandem. It's actually displayed or being illustrated in the example in the very opening chapter. The people are there outside the temple and they are praying. So temple and prayer are associated in Luke's gospel and in the mind of Jesus. So if you turn then to Acts chapter 2, the first 4 verses, mention is made again of a transition, so maybe we'll see. So
Just
Yeah.
in mind.
Yeah. torn, there's one, it's one of many reminders that in Christ, the old has been fulfilled and the new is coming. And so when we see here the fact that in essence, the church becomes the temple, filled with the glorious presence of God, and the temple has already been told to be the place of prayer, it makes perfect sense that from this point forward, the church, among other functions, functions as a community of prayer. And some of the prayers are taking place individually. Again, it's not to say that there's no place for personal, private prayer. Again, we talked about, but interestingly enough, so often the prayer is taking place within the community. Sometimes it's the leaders, sometimes it's the people praying for the leaders, it's praying for moments of persecution, it's praying for provision for God to give wisdom and to bless, those who would be preaching the gospel and all the rest. But the point being here is that the temple of God is where prayer takes place, and now the church, by the presence of the Spirit of the resurrected Christ, the church is being designated as the temple. What happens at the temple? Well, prayer happens. Edith, did you want to?
Okay.
So it's all of this to show again this beautiful that is on display here. One that some other things we talked about. In conjunction with taking up the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, and then prayer, talking about praying always in the Spirit continuously with all kinds of petitions, then says, pray for me that I might preach the gospel boldly as I should. And so the Spirit work together. And the point of this exercise is to demonstrate how beautifully that pattern is set in the very development that Luke would give us here of this movement of, again, almost being prayerless. The disciples were not, they're asking about prayer. They're interested in prayer. They watch Jesus praying. They receive teaching about it. But at the same time, the crucial moment becomes when through the giving of the Spirit, the church becomes the living temple of God himself. And from that point forward, Luke says that temple has got to be a place where prayer is transpiring constantly. Now, really interesting here, we have to close with this. We'll come back next time and start with this and then work into our next topic. One of the things that really fascinated me was this account of Cornelius the centurion and Peter. And you might want to go back and look at, because Peter, it's one of these interesting places where it's told to us what happens. And then as the figures talk to each other, they tell one another what happened. And then Peter goes back to the church and he tells the church what happened. And what's so fascinating, Peter says, I was on the rooftop praying. And Cornelius says, we were all praying. And then Peter says, when he goes back to the church, that Cornelius was praying. And I was praying. And you almost get this amazing sense of how it is that God was accomplishing his purposes as praying people kind of meet in the middle. And it's just the way in which Luke would take precious real estate, right, in his gospel to repeat these things. The biblical writers don't repeat things unless we're intended to take hold of it. And that we would be told that both Peter and Cornelius were praying simultaneously, and then that they would report how they were praying after the event of God through his Spirit blessing Peter's preaching. Is really an important reminder how much God works through prayer. So that's the lesson I hope that we take away. We are the Spirit indwelt temple of God. Temple of God. So we'll talk about J first, see what he means by that, for some other patterns that relate to praying and some practical ways that we approach prayer as Christ's. So thank you, and we'll see you a little bit